Level 4. Around the World in 80 Days. Copyright 2009. Compass Publishing. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. Phileas Fogg hires a new servant. In the year 1872, Phileas Fogg lived in the house at number 7, Savile Row, in London. He was an unusual gentleman because he did not want people to notice him. He was handsome, polite, and wealthy. He was not a lawyer, or a stockbroker, or a businessman. He did not own a factory or any land. He was not a member of the royal family, and was not a member of any of the many societies in London at that time. He was a member of the Reform Club, but nobody at the club knew anything about him. He was generous when money was needed for charity, and seemed to know a lot about different places in the world. However, he did not talk very much and never spoke about himself. One thing that everybody knew was that he had not been away from London for many years. People who knew him would tell you that you could see him walk from his house to the club every day. At the club, he read the papers and played whist. He never kept the money that he won when he played whist, but gave it to charity. He enjoyed the game because it was a challenge, and he did not have to travel or tire himself out to play it. As far as was known, Phileas Fogg did not have a wife or children, nor did he have any relatives or friends at all. He lived alone in his house with one servant, and never let visitors into it. This unusual gentleman did the same thing every day. He always had his lunch and dinner at the club, always at the same time and always at the same table. He never invited anybody to eat with him. Every night, he returned home at exactly midnight. He spent 10 hours every day at home, sleeping and getting ready to go to the club. When he went for a walk, it was always at a very even speed, like a machine. His house was comfortable, and his servant did not have to work hard. However, Phileas Fogg did want his servant to do everything correctly. On the morning of October 2nd, 1872, Mr. Fogg dismissed his servant because the water for his shave was not quite hot enough. Therefore, he was waiting for his new servant to arrive. He sat in his armchair with his feet together and his hands on his knees. His back was straight as he watched the hands of the clock move forward. He always went to the club at 11:30, and it was almost that time now. The new servant arrived. He told Mr. Fogg that he was French and that his name was Jean Passepartout. "I have worked as a singer, a horse rider in a circus, an acrobat, a teacher of gymnastics, and a fireman. I heard that you are a very precise person who never leaves London, and decided that I would like to work for you." "I have good reports about you," said Mr. Fogg. "What time is it?" Passepartout looked at his watch. 11:22. "Your watch is 4 minutes slow." "That is impossible, sir." "It is not important. We only need to note that we have a difference in time. From this moment, 11:26, on the 2nd of October, 1872, you are working for me." Phileas Fogg stood up, put on his hat, and walked out of the house to the club. It was 11:30. Passepartout was now alone in the house. In the few minutes that he had spoken with his new master, he had already learned a lot about him. He seemed to be a man of mathematical precision, who planned what he did every day, and then kept his plan as if he were a machine. He did not move unnecessarily, and was always focused on what he was doing. He was never angry, and never in a hurry, yet he was never late. He lived his life without any social relationships, because these would have disturbed his routines. Passepartout was a very different man. He was a Parisian who had lived in London for 5 years. He had not been able to find a master that he could happily serve. He was a good, kind, helpful man with a friendly face. He had blue eyes in his plump face, and his arms and legs were very strong. Would he be a suitable servant for Phileas Fogg? It was too early to say. Passepartout wanted a quiet life, but the English families he had worked for up to now had wanted to travel. He heard about Phileas Fogg's quiet and orderly life, and thought that he would be very happy to serve in his house. Now that he was alone, He looked around the house. It was clean and tidy, and everything seemed well planned. It pleased him. He found the bedroom that would be his. On the wall, he saw a piece of paper that listed the jobs he was to complete every day, beginning at 8 o'clock in the morning until 11:30, when Fogg went to the Reform Club. Every detail was there: tea and toast at 8:23, shaving water at 9:37, and so on. Then the jobs to be done after 11:30 were all written down. Even the clothes and shoes were planned. Each had a number and was worn in rotation with the others. Passepartout was very happy. This was exactly what he wanted, and he memorized all the jobs. He rubbed his hands together and said to himself, "This is perfect. I am sure that I will be very happy to serve this gentleman. He is like a clock, and I will always know what to do. I am very lucky to get a job with him." Chapter 2. Phileas Fogg Makes a Bet. Phileas Fogg walked along the street. He put his right foot in front of his left foot 575 times. He put his left foot in front of his right foot 576 times. Then he arrived at the Reform Club. He went straight to the dining room and sat at his usual table. He enjoyed a splendid lunch, served with cups of tea. At 12:47, he got up and walked to the drawing room and read the newspapers until dinner time. Dinner was exactly the same as lunch. At 6:20, he returned to the drawing room and read the papers for another half hour. Then he joined a group of 5 wealthy businessmen who all loved to play whist. One of them was a director of the Bank of England. One of the others asked the director about the robbery that had just occurred. This robbery had occurred 3 days earlier. A sum of £55,000 had been taken from the desk of a bank teller while he was busy, and the thief had not been caught. The police were looking for a man who was in the room at the time. He was described as a well-dressed and good-mannered gentleman. The police were watching all the ports in England to stop the thief from escaping and had offered a reward of £2,000, as well as 5% of the amount recovered. The police thought that they would soon catch the thief, and the bank director was not very worried. "I think he will escape," said one of the other whist players. "Where do you think he will go?" asked the bank director. "I don't know. The world is a big place." "It used to be a big place," said Phileas Fogg. "It's a lot smaller now." The bank director agreed. "It is smaller because now you can travel around it 10 times more quickly than you could 100 years ago. You can do it in 80 days. I read it in the newspaper," said one of the other players. "But there could be bad weather, shipwrecks, and many other problems that delay the trip. It might be 80 days on the timetables, but I don't think it will work if you try it." "I'm sure it will," replied Phileas Fogg. "I'd like to see you prove it. I bet £4,000 that you can't do it." Each of the 5 players said that they would bet the same amount. "I'll do it," said Mr. Fogg calmly. "I have £20,000 with Baring Brothers. I am ready to risk it." They could hardly believe him. "You will lose all that money if there's an unexpected delay." "I do not believe in the unexpected," replied Mr. Fogg. "When will you go?" "Now. The train to Dover leaves at 8:45. I will be on it." "Tonight?" "Yes, tonight." "It is Wednesday, the 2nd of October, and I will be back in this room at 8:45 on Saturday, the 21st of December. If I am not here, you may cash this check for £20,000 and share the money among yourselves." The 6 men wrote it all down on a piece of paper and signed it. It was 7 o'clock, and they expected their friend to stop playing and prepare for his trip. "I am always ready," he said, and continued to play. He played for another 25 minutes and then walked home. Passepartout was very surprised to see him. The piece of paper said that he would return home at midnight, but it was only 10 to 8. He was even more surprised when Mr. Fogg told him that they were leaving in 10 minutes and going around the world. Passepartout was very disappointed. This was not what he had expected. "Just pack a few small bags," Mr. Fogg told him. "We don't need suitcases. We will buy anything that we need along the way." Passepartout thought that his master was joking, but he soon realized that he was serious. Phileas Fogg never joked. At 8 o'clock, they were ready to leave. Phileas Fogg carried a ship and train timetable, and put £20,000 in Passepartout's bag. "Be careful with it," he said. They locked the door and went to the railway station. Phileas Fogg saw a poor woman begging and gave her the money he had won at whist that evening. He told Passepartout to buy 2 tickets to Paris. The 5 men from the Reform Club were at the station to say goodbye. Mr. Fogg promised them that he would have his passport stamped as he went along. "I will be back at the Reform Club at 8:45 on the evening of December 21st, he said, and got on the train. At 8:45, the train blew its whistle and started on its journey. The news of the bet went around the Reform Club and then got into the newspapers. All over London, people made their own bets. Would he return in 80 days? At first, some people thought that it might be possible, but most people disagreed. One of the newspapers tried to prove that it could not be done. If there was only one delay, it said, the whole plan would be ruined. It listed the many things that could go wrong. After that, almost nobody believed it could be done. 7 days later, the police chief in London received a message from a police officer in Suez. It asked him to send an arrest warrant so that he could arrest Phileas Fogg, the man who had taken £55,000 from the Bank of England. Now, everybody thought that Phileas Fogg was a thief. He matched the description of the man the police were hunting. Obviously, the story about traveling around the world in 80 days was only a way to help him escape from London. Chapter 3. Passepartout Says Too Much. Everybody believed that Phileas Fogg was the thief who had stolen £55,000 from the Bank of England, and that the bet was just a clever trick to fool the police. They thought this because the police had received a telegram from Suez asking for an arrest warrant. Why did the police officer in Suez send this telegram? On Wednesday, the 9th of October, a very large steamship called the Mongolia was due to arrive in Suez at 11 o'clock in the morning. It was going from Brindisi to Bombay via the Suez Canal. The canal had been opened 3 years earlier and had cut the time for a journey from London to Bombay in half. On this morning, 2 people were waiting for the Mongolia. One was the British consul, and the other was a thin man called Mr. Fix. He was a police officer who had recently seen the description of the well-dressed gentleman who had been seen in the bank on the morning that the money was taken. He was watching the passengers on every ship to see if one of them might be the thief. He wanted the large reward that was offered by the bank. The consul and the police officer talked about the robbery while they waited. "How will you recognize the thief? The description is not very clear." "Trust me, sir, I am an experienced police officer. I can recognize a criminal when I see one. If he is on the ship, he won't escape. But the description says he looks like a gentleman." "Yes, of course," replied Mr. Fix. "People who look like criminals are carefully watched by the police so that they don't dare to commit crimes. A good police officer like me will look carefully at people who do not look like criminals. That is why my work is not really a job. It is an art." The consul went back to his office, and Mr. Fix continued to walk up and down, waiting for the ship. He knew that the ship would stay in Suez for 4 hours to refuel and then go straight to Bombay. He believed that the thief, if he was on the ship, would not go to Bombay, which was English territory. He would get off in Suez and try to find his way to a part of Asia that did not belong to England. It would be more difficult to arrest him in those countries. When the large ship arrived, Mr. Fix looked closely at all the passengers that came ashore. There were a lot of them. One of them asked him the way to the consul's office. He had a passport and showed it to Mr. Fix. Mr. Fix looked at the passport and saw that the description was exactly the same as that of the thief. He looked at the passenger. "This is not your passport, is it?" he asked. "No, it is my master's passport," said Passepartout. "He is still on the ship." Mr. Fix told him that his master should come to the office with his passport, and Passepartout went back onto the ship to get Phileas Fogg. Mr. Fix quickly went to the consul's office and told the consul what had happened. "If he is the thief," said the consul, "he won't come to the office. He does not need to show his passport, and I'm sure that he doesn't want to tell the police where he is." "Sir, I think he is very clever. He will come to the office so that we do not suspect him. However, I hope that you will not stamp it. I need to keep him here for a few days so that I can get a warrant for his arrest from London. I'm sorry, said the consul. "If his passport is in order, I can't refuse to stamp it." At that moment, there was a knock on the door, and Phileas Fogg and Passepartout came in. Mr. Fogg asked the consul to stamp his passport. The consul read it carefully. "Are you Mr. Phileas Fogg?" "Yes." "Where are you going?" "To Bombay." "Do you know that you don't need to show your passport?" "Yes, but I want to prove that I have been here." Mr. Fix stood in a corner and looked carefully at Phileas Fogg and Passepartout. The consul stamped the passport, and his two visitors left. Mr. Fix followed them. He decided that he would try to find out more about Phileas Fogg by speaking to Passepartout. Phileas Fogg returned to the ship and wrote the details of this part of the trip in his notebook. He could see that he had not lost any time yet, but that he was not ahead of his schedule either. He did not bother to go and look at the sights of Suez. Instead, he had his lunch in his cabin. Mr. Fix, however, followed Passepartout into the town and was soon talking to him. It did not take long for him to find out that Passepartout had not expected to travel this far and that his master was in a hurry. "He left without enough clothes," Passepartout told him, "and I have to buy some new ones." Mr. Fix offered to help him, and the two men went into the shops together. "I must be careful not to miss the ship," said Passepartout, looking at his watch. "You have enough time," replied Mr. Fix. "It is just midday." "Midday? It's only 9:52. "Your watch is slow," replied Mr. Fix. "That's not possible. It was my grandfather's watch, and it has never been slow. It is very accurate." "Ah, you are keeping London time," explained the police officer, "which is about 2 hours behind Suez. You need to change your watch to the new time in every country. I will never change my watch because my watch cannot be wrong. Then your watch won't be in time with the sun. Then the sun will be wrong." Passepartout put his watch back in his pocket. "Where is your master going?" asked Mr. Fix. "Around the world," replied Passepartout. "He is going around the world in 80 days for a bet. However, I don't believe it. It doesn't make sense." They continued to talk, and Passepartout told him that Phileas Fogg was carrying a large amount of money. He also told him that he had only started to work for Mr. Fogg on the day that they left. Mr. Fix was certain that Phileas Fogg was the thief. He went to the telegraph office and sent a telegram to the London police, asking for a warrant to be sent to Bombay. He would arrest Fogg there, he thought. Then he got onto the ship, and soon it was on its way down the Red Sea. Chapter 4. Passepartout visits a temple. The Mongolia was a very fast ship, and it traveled quickly down to Aden. Most of the passengers were army officers and government officials, and life on the ship was very pleasant. There was always lots of food. There was music and even dancing when the sea was calm. But whether the sea was calm or rough, Phileas Fogg remained the same. He did not come up onto the decks and did not take any interest in the sights of the Red Sea. He just ate his 4 meals every day and played whist. He had found some partners, and they played for many hours every day. The day after they left Suez, Passepartout was on deck when he met Mr. Fix. Mr. Fix told him that he worked for the ship's company. He did not want Passepartout to know that he was a police officer who was trying to arrest Phileas Fogg. After this, they often met and talked to each other. The ship passed Mocha on the 13th of October and reached Aden the next day. It was 15 hours ahead of schedule. Here, it took on more fuel, which took 4 hours. Phileas Fogg went ashore and had his passport stamped, and then returned to the ship while Passepartout looked around the town. That evening, the Mongolia left Aden and headed across the Indian Ocean toward Bombay. The sea was calm, and the wind came from the right direction. The ship used its sails as well as its engines to travel quickly to Bombay, where it arrived 2 days early, on the 20th of October. India was a very large country. It had 1,400,000 square miles of land and a population of 180 million. It was part of the British Empire, but some parts of it were still very independent. Until 1857, the famous East India Company was very powerful. It bought most of the land from the Rajas. However, the lands were now controlled by the British government. Every part of India was different, and it was once very difficult to travel from one part of it to another. In 1872, however, There were steamboats going up and down the main rivers, and a railway crossed the entire country from Bombay to Calcutta. The journey could be made in 3 days. If the railway line were a straight line between the two cities, the journey would have taken even less time. But it detoured north to take in Allahabad. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Mr. Fogg and Passepartout disembarked in Bombay. Mr. Fix also disembarked. Passepartout went to the shops to buy some things that his master wanted, while Phileas Fogg walked to the passport office. When his passport was stamped, he walked to the railway station and ordered a meal. Mr. Fix went straight to the police station and asked if the arrest warrant had arrived. It had not. Mr. Fix asked the Bombay police to give him a warrant, but they said that they couldn't because the crime had not been committed in India. Mr. Fix was disappointed, but he thought that Phileas Fogg would stay in Bombay for a while, so he decided to wait. Passepartout bought some shirts and socks. Then he walked around the streets of Bombay, looking at the many different kinds of people that he saw there. He was very interested in everything that he saw. He saw a temple and went in to have a look at it. He did not know that he had to take off his shoes. He was admiring the beautiful ornaments in the temple when somebody knocked him down and 3 priests took off his shoes and socks. They shouted at him and began to hit him. Passepartout got up and knocked 2 of the priests to the floor. Then he ran from the temple as quickly as he could. The train for Calcutta was due to leave at 8 o'clock. Passepartout arrived at the station at 5 minutes to 8. He had lost his hat and the shirts and socks that he had bought and had no shoes. Mr. Fix was at the station and saw him arrive. Passepartout did not see him, but Mr. Fix heard Passepartout tell his master about the attack in the temple. Mr. Fix realized that he could now get a warrant for Passepartout's arrest because he had committed a crime in India. The British government had made laws that punished people who acted against India's religious rules. Mr. Fix went to the police station to try to get a warrant for his arrest, but it took too long and he did not catch the train. Phileas Fogg and Passepartout shared a passenger car on the train with Sir Francis Cromarty. Phileas Fogg had played whist with him on the Mongolia. Sir Francis knew about Phileas Fogg's plan to travel around the world in 80 days and wondered whether Phileas Fogg would do anything useful or good in his life. He tried to tell his friend about the country they were passing through, but Mr. Fogg was not interested. "Your servant almost ruined your plan," said Sir Francis. "How?" asked Phileas Fogg. "He could have been arrested for that trouble in the temple," replied Sir Francis. "How would that ruin my plan?" asked Phileas again. "He would have been put in jail, and you would have had to wait for him." "Not at all," replied Phileas. "I would have given him some money and gone on without him." The train traveled through the night as the gentlemen slept. In the morning, Passepartout looked out of the window to watch the scenery. At first, they were traveling across a plain. Then they traveled through a jungle. He saw a tiger run away from the sound of the train. Later, they traveled through a forest. He saw elephants looking at the train as it sped past. At midday, the train stopped at Burhanpur, and Passepartout bought some slippers. The travelers had lunch, and the train set off again. Chapter 5. The newspapers are wrong. As they sped across India, Passepartout thought about his master. Until then, he had not believed that he intended to travel around the world in 80 days. He did not believe the story of the bet. Now, he had changed his mind. It must be true. He even began to worry that the train was not moving fast enough. He did not want his master to lose the bet. He was very sorry that he had gone into the temple. He had almost ruined his master's plan. He decided to be more helpful. The next day, the 22nd of October, Sir Francis asked Passepartout about the time. Passepartout took out his watch. 3 o'clock in the morning, sir, he replied. Sir Francis explained to him that this could not be correct. It is 3 o'clock in London, but it is 7 o'clock here. You should change the time on your watch by 4 minutes for every degree of longitude that we pass, he said. It was no use. Passepartout would not change the time on his watch. An hour later, the train stopped. They were 15 miles from the station at Rothhall. They had stopped in the middle of a forest, but the conductor went through all the cars telling the passengers to get off. There was no station. Passepartout got off the train and came back very quickly. Sir, The railway has ended." "What do you mean?" asked Sir Francis Cromarty. "There is no more railway line. The train can go no further." Sir Francis and Phileas Fogg asked the guard where they were. "In a small town called Colby," he replied. "Are we stopping here?" "I think so. The railway line is not finished yet. They are still building it." "The newspapers said the line was finished," said Phileas Fogg. "What can I say? The newspapers are wrong. There are still 50 miles of track to build before we get to Allahabad. The line continues there." Sir Francis was angry. "The ticket says Bombay to Calcutta. Everybody knows that they must find other transport between Colby and Allahabad," replied the guard. Phileas Fogg was not worried. "We will find another way," he said. "It's not a problem. We are 2 days ahead of schedule. I'm sure we will get to Calcutta on time to catch the steamship to Hong Kong." By this time, the other passengers had all found carriages and carts. There were none left for Phileas Fogg, Sir Francis, and Passepartout. "I will walk," said Phileas Fogg. "Sir, I have found some transport," said Passepartout. "What is it?" "An elephant." "Let us go and see it," said Phileas Fogg. 5 minutes later, an Indian man was showing them his elephant. Mr. Fogg tried to hire the elephant and offered £10 per hour. The Indian refused. Mr. Fogg offered £20 and then £40, but the Indian still refused. Phileas Fogg then offered to buy the elephant for £1,000, but still the Indian refused. At last, he agreed to sell it for £2,000. They found a guide who was also an elephant driver. Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty sat in baskets, one on each side of the elephant. The driver sat on the elephant's neck, and Passepartout sat behind him. At 9 o'clock, the elephant walked into the forest with its passengers. The guide told them that they could save 20 miles by taking a shorter route through the forest to Allahabad. After traveling for 2 hours, the driver stopped the elephant for a rest. It ate some branches and bushes and drank some water. The passengers were also happy to have a rest. At midday, they moved on. They traveled into an area of Upper Bundelkhand that was rarely visited. They saw some fierce-looking Indians, and the guide kept the elephant well away from them. Passepartout was thinking about the elephant. What would happen to it when they reached Allahabad? Would his master keep it and take it with him? Would he sell it? Would he set it free? At 8 o'clock that night, they stopped at an old house to sleep. They were halfway to Allahabad. It was a cold night, but the travelers were tired, and they all slept well. They set off again at 6 o'clock in the morning, hoping to reach Allahabad that night. They came down the Vindhyas mountains and went around the town of Kalinjar. They stopped under some trees for lunch. Allahabad was only 12 miles away. At 2 o'clock, they set off through a dense forest. At 4 o'clock, they heard noises ahead of them and hid behind some trees. They watched silently as a group of priests came past, singing, dancing, and making music. A large group of men, women, and children followed the priests, all singing a sad song. Behind them was a cart with large wheels carrying the statue of a red woman with 4 arms and a lot of wild hair. It frightened Passepartout, but he remained quiet. "It's the goddess Kali," whispered Sir Francis. "She is the goddess of love and death." Some very old men were dancing around the statue. As they danced, they cut themselves with knives. Behind the cart was another group of priests. They were dragging a beautiful young woman with them. She was wearing many jewels. Behind her were some guards with swords and guns. They were carrying a bed. The dead body of an old man lay on the bed. He was dressed in very expensive clothes. It was easy to see that he was an important man. Musicians followed the guards at the end of the procession. Sir Francis turned to the others. "It's a suttee," he said. The guide nodded his agreement. "What is a suttee?" asked Phileas Fogg. Sir Francis explained. "The young woman will be burned alive. She is the wife of the Rajah, whose body you saw on the bed. When they burn his body tomorrow morning, they will burn her with it." "That's terrible!" exclaimed Passepartout. "The British have tried to stop suttees, but in some parts of India they still do it," explained the guide. "Sometimes the wives want to be killed, but most often they do not. This woman does not want to die, and they have drugged her to stop her from fighting and trying to escape." The guide led the elephant out of the trees and was ready to go on to Allahabad. Phileas Fogg stopped him. "I want to rescue this woman," he said. Chapter 6. Phileas Fogg meets Mrs. Aouda. Phileas Fogg wanted to rescue the young woman from the suttee. It would be difficult and dangerous to do this. It would also take time. "It will put you behind schedule," Sir Francis pointed out. "I am still 12 hours ahead," replied Phileas Fogg. Sir Francis said that he would help. The driver also said he would help, but told them that if they were caught, they could be tortured and killed. Despite this, they decided to go ahead. The guide told them about the young woman. She was an Indian lady from a wealthy family. She had been educated in England. Her parents had died, and she had to marry the old Raja from Upper Bundelkhand. He died 3 months later. She tried to run away from the suttee, but they caught her quickly and brought her back. Now they are going to burn the old Raja's body, and she would be burned alive with him. The 4 men went to the temple of Pilaji, where the suttee would take place. They hid in some bushes about 500 yards from the temple. They could hear the priests and musicians singing and howling. They waited until it began to grow dark, and then went quietly toward the temple. They passed a large pile of wood and saw the Raja's body, lying on top of it, ready to be burned. They crept through the long grass toward the temple. There were guards near the door, and they waited to see if they might fall asleep. They waited a long time, but the guards did not fall asleep. At midnight, they went around to the back of the temple, where there were no windows or doors. This side of the temple was not guarded, and the 4 men quickly began to make a hole in the wall with their pocket knives. Suddenly, they heard a shout inside the temple, and another outside of it. Had somebody seen them? They moved back into the trees and waited. Some guards came to the back of the temple and stayed there. How could they rescue the young lady now? The guide and Sir Francis said they should leave and go to Allahabad, but Phileas Fogg told them to wait. "There is nothing we can do," they told him. "I don't have to be in Allahabad until midday," replied Phileas Fogg, "so we can wait until morning to see if there is a way to rescue her then." They agreed to wait, although it would be dangerous, and there was little hope of rescuing the lady. As it began to grow light, they saw the priests drag the young woman toward the pile of wood. Phileas Fogg had a knife and was about to rush out and try to save her, but Sir Francis held him back. "They will kill you before you get near her," he said. They put the young woman next to the body of her husband on the wood pile. Then they lit the wood, which quickly began to burn. Suddenly, the priests cried out in fear. What was happening? The dead Raja seemed to stand up, carrying the young woman in his arms. He climbed off the wood pile with her. The priests and guards were terrified and threw themselves to the ground. They did not dare to look at this ghost. The ghost walked toward Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis and said to them, "Let's get out of here." It was Passepartout. He had rescued the young lady and terrified the crowd. The 4 men disappeared into the forest and were soon speeding away on the elephant, still carrying the young lady. The priests soon realized what had happened and chased them. However, the elephant was too fast, and they escaped. Passepartout was very pleased and proud. Sir Francis shook his hand. Even his master said, "Well done." The young lady had fainted and had not woken up yet. Sir Francis told Phileas Fogg that if she remained in India, she would be caught again and killed. Phileas, however, would not tell him what he planned to do. At Allahabad, Passepartout was sent to buy her some clothes, while the gentleman waited for the train at the station. The young lady began to wake up, and they discovered that her name was Mrs. Aouda. Passepartout returned with the clothes as the train was preparing to leave for Benares. Phileas Fogg paid the elephant driver. Then he gave the elephant to the driver, who was delighted with this very valuable reward. Soon they were speeding toward Benares. Mrs. Aouda listened to the story of her rescue and was very thankful. However, it was easy to see that she was still afraid. Phileas Fogg offered to take her with him to Hong Kong. This made her feel a lot safer. "I have a rich relative in Hong Kong," she said. "I'm sure that he will look after me." 2 hours later, they were in Benares on the Ganges River. Here, Sir Francis Cromarty said goodbye to his new friends, and they traveled on without him. The train sped through the Ganges Valley that night and arrived at Calcutta at 7 o'clock in the morning. The steamer for Hong Kong was due to leave at midday. Phileas Fogg was still on schedule. Mr. Phileas Fogg? It was a police officer who spoke to the traveler as he left the station. Yes? Is this man your servant? Yes. Please, come with me. Phileas, Passepartout, and Mrs. Awuda followed him to the police station. Here they were locked in a room. You will appear before Judge Obadiah at 8:30, he said. Mrs. Awuda and Passepartout were very worried, but Phileas Fogg was as calm as always. We will be on the ship before midday, he said. At 8:30, the door opened, and the police officer took them to a courtroom. Passepartout thought that they had been arrested for rescuing Mrs. Awuda, but he was wrong. They had been arrested because Passepartout went into a temple in Bombay while wearing his shoes. 2 priests from the temple were witnesses, and they had Passepartout's shoes for proof. Mr. Fix had caught the next train and passed Phileas Fogg and his companions while they were rescuing Mrs. Awuda. Now he sat in the courtroom, smiling. He still did not have a warrant. However, he was sure that the court would put Passepartout in prison. Phileas Fogg would have to wait for him, and the warrant should arrive before they left Calcutta. The first part of his plan worked. The judge said that Passepartout would have to go to jail for 15 days and fined him £300. Then he said that Phileas Fogg would have to go to jail for 8 days and fined him £150. Mr. Fix was surprised when the next part of his plan did not work. Phileas Fogg told the judge that he would pay a bigger fine so they wouldn't have to go to jail. The judge agreed to £1,000 each. Passepartout took his shoes, and the travelers took a carriage to the ship. Mr. Fix was very disappointed. He followed them, although they did not see him. I will follow them to Hong Kong and wait for the warrant there, he told himself. Chapter 7. On Board the Rangoon. The Rangoon was a good ship. It was just as fast as the Mongolia, though it was not as comfortable. Phileas Fogg wanted to make the journey as pleasant for Mrs. Awuda as he could. She understood this and did not complain. She began to like him and wondered why he was always polite and never showed any emotion. Passepartout explained the bet to her. He told her that his master was sometimes more like a machine than a man. She thought Phileas Fogg was unusual and interesting. She looked at him with her beautiful eyes, but he did not seem to notice. The first part of this journey went well. Soon they could see the island of Great Andaman with its 2,400-foot-high mountain. The ship stayed close to the shore and quickly reached the Strait of Malacca, which led to the China Sea. Mr. Fix, meanwhile, was also on the Rangoon. He had asked the police at Calcutta to send the warrant to Hong Kong when it arrived. Now he was hiding in his cabin. He hoped that Passepartout would not see him. He had to arrest Phileas Fogg in Hong Kong. It would be very difficult to arrest him if he went on to America, because then he would no longer be on British territory. I must delay him in Hong Kong, he told himself. He thought about telling Passepartout that his master was a thief. This would be a big risk. He would only do that if there was no other way to stop Phileas Fogg from leaving Hong Kong. Who is that beautiful young woman? He wondered. Perhaps she was helping him, or perhaps Phileas Fogg had kidnapped her. He decided to send a telegraph from Singapore to China to tell the police that Fogg was on his way. He decided that he should talk to Passepartout again and see what he could find out from him. He left his cabin and soon found Passepartout, who was very surprised to see him again. They were soon talking like old friends, and it wasn't long before Passepartout told Mr. Fix about Mrs. Awuda. We rescued her in India, and we are taking her to Hong Kong to be with her relatives, he said. Passepartout and Mr. Fix met each other often after that. Mr. Fogg played whist with some friends he had found on the ship and often sat with Mrs. Awuda. Passepartout wondered why Mr. Fix was on the same ship as them again. Suddenly, he had an idea. He decided that Mr. Fix was working for the members of the Reform Club. He was checking that Phileas Fogg really did go around the world. He was a spy. Passepartout was angry. They should trust his master instead of paying a spy to watch him. He did not tell Mr. Fix what he thought, but decided that he would get his revenge on him later. On the 30th of October, the Rangoon entered the Strait of Malacca, which separates the Malay Peninsula from the island of Sumatra. The next day, it stopped at Singapore to take on more coal. It was about half a day ahead of schedule. Phileas Fogg went ashore with Mrs. Aouda, secretly followed by Mr. Fix. Passepartout did his usual shopping. They all came back to the Rangoon a few hours later, and it soon set off toward Hong Kong, which was 1,300 miles away. Phileas Fogg had 6 days to get there. That was when a ship was leaving for Yokohama, in Japan. There were a lot of passengers on the Rangoon for this part of the journey. The weather was bad and the sea was rough. Luckily, the wind was blowing from the south, which helped the steamship to go faster. Sometimes the sea was so rough that the ship had to slow down or find shelter near the land. Passepartout was impatient, but nothing seemed to worry Phileas Fogg. "Are you really in a hurry to get to Hong Kong?" Mr. Fix asked Passepartout one day. "Yes, a terrible hurry. My master must catch the ship that goes to Yokohama." "Do you really believe this story of the bet to go around the world in 80 days? "Yes, of course. Don't you?" "No, I don't believe it," said the police officer. "You are a real jester," said Passepartout. This worried Mr. Fix. Why had Passepartout called him a jester? "Are you stopping in Hong Kong, or are you coming with us to Yokohama and America?" asked Passepartout, smiling. "I'm not sure," replied Mr. Fix, looking carefully at his friend. "Why not? I'm sure you are not paying for your trip," laughed Passepartout. Mr. Fix went to his cabin. Why had Passepartout laughed at him? He was sure that Passepartout had guessed that he was a police officer. Had he told his master? Mr. Fix was not sure what to do. Passepartout meanwhile could see that Mrs. Aouda was falling in love with his master. Phileas Fogg, however, did not seem to notice. The last few days of the trip to Hong Kong were very bad. The weather was terrible, and a strong wind blew from the north. This slowed down the steamship. It rolled around on the high waves, and most of the passengers felt sick. During the 3rd and 4th of November, there was a bad storm, and the Rangoon had to take shelter for half a day. It could not make any progress. It seemed certain that the ship would arrive late in Hong Kong. If the storm did not stop soon, the ship might be 20 hours late. Then Phileas Fogg would miss the ship to Yokohama. However, the traveler remained calm. He never seemed to worry about anything. Mr. Fix, however, was very happy about the storm. It was exactly what he wanted. Any delay was welcome because it would make Phileas Fogg stay in Hong Kong until there was another ship going to Yokohama. He felt sick, but he didn't care. He was happy. Chapter 8. Mr. Fix and Passepartout have a drink together. The storm made Mr. Fix happy because he wanted Phileas Fogg to be delayed in Hong Kong. Passepartout, however, was not happy at all. He was very worried. Everything was going wrong now, and his master might lose his bet. He stayed on the decks and did everything he could to help the ship's crew. He asked the captain and the other officers a lot of questions about the weather, but they just laughed at him for being so worried. They could not tell him how long the storm would last. Like all storms, however, it did end. It was now the 4th of November, and the wind swung around and helped the ship go faster. But it was not possible to make up the time that was lost. The ship to Yokohama left Hong Kong on the 5th of November, but the Rangoon would not arrive until the 6th. At 6 o'clock that morning, the pilot came on board the ship to steer it into the harbor. Passepartout wanted to ask the pilot if the ship for Yokohama had already left, but he did not dare. He was afraid of the answer he might hear. Mr. Fogg, however, was not afraid. "Do you know when the next ship goes to Yokohama?" he asked the pilot. "Tomorrow morning at high tide." "Which ship is it?" "The Carnatic." "But wasn't it going to depart today?" "Yes, that's right," agreed the pilot. "However, it needed some repairs, so the departure has been delayed until tomorrow." "Thank you," said Phileas Fogg and returned to his cabin. Passepartout heard this conversation and was delighted. They were very lucky. Because the Carnatic needed repairs, they would still be able to go to Yokohama on it. They would be late, but they would be able to make up the time. The next ship was not due to leave for another 8 days. That would have made it impossible for Phileas Fogg to complete his journey in 80 days. The Rangoon arrived at 1 o'clock that afternoon, and the passengers went ashore. Phileas Fogg took Mrs. Aouda to the best hotel and booked a room for her. He went to the stock exchange to search for her relative. He soon discovered that the rich relative had left Hong Kong 2 years ago and was living in Europe. He returned to the hotel and told Mrs. Awuda his news. "What should I do?" she asked. "Come to London," he replied. "You are welcome to come with us." He told Passepartout to book an extra cabin on the Carnatic. Passepartout was delighted and left immediately. Hong Kong was only a small island and had been a British territory for about 30 years. It had a lot of buildings that looked English. Passepartout looked at them as he walked to Victoria Harbour. It was like walking through Calcutta, Bombay, or Singapore. As he came closer to the Carnatic, he saw Mr. Fix walking up and down looking annoyed. "Good," thought Passepartout. "It is not going well for the members of the Reform Club." He went up to his friend smiling. Mr. Fix was annoyed because the warrant had not arrived. Of course, Passepartout knew nothing about that. "Are you coming to America with us?" he asked. "Yes," replied Mr. Fix, with his teeth together. Passepartout laughed. "I knew you would. Come and book a cabin with me." The two men went into the office and booked their cabins. The clerk told them that the repairs had been finished and that the Carnatic would depart that evening at 8 o'clock. "Good," said Passepartout. "My master will be very happy. I'll go and tell him." At that moment, Mr. Fix decided to act. He would tell Passepartout everything. It was perhaps the only way to keep Phileas Fogg in Hong Kong for a few more days. He invited his friend to have a drink in a hotel near the harbor. They went into the hotel and soon realized that they had chosen a bad place. There were a lot of men sitting around and smoking opium. Most of the people who were addicted to this drug died within 5 years. Mr. Fix bought some wine and talked about the trip to America as they drank it. Passepartout got up to go and tell his master that the ship was leaving that evening, but Mr. Fix held him back. "I have something important to tell you," he said. "We can talk about it tomorrow," said Passepartout. "We don't have time now." "It's about your master." Passepartout sat down again. "Have you guessed who I am?" asked Mr. Fix. "Of course, but let me tell you that those gentlemen at the club are wasting their money." Mr. Fix did not understand this, but offered him £500 to help him keep Phileas Fogg in Hong Kong for a few days. Passepartout was very angry. It is bad enough to spy on him. Now they want to try and stop him? My master is a good man, but his partners at the Reform Club are bad. They are supposed to be his friends. "I am not a spy for the members of the Reform Club," explained Mr. Fix. "I am a police officer." He showed Passepartout his badge. Passepartout was so surprised that he could not speak. Mr. Fix explained that Phileas Fogg was a thief who had stolen £55,000 from the Bank of England. Of course, Passepartout would not believe him. "My master is the most honest man in the world." "How do you know? You only began to work for him the day you started your journey. He left London with a large sum of money." Passepartout was confused, but he still refused to believe it or to help Mr. Fix. "You won't help me?" "No." "Then let's forget everything I said. Have another drink." They had another drink, but Mr. Fix put some opium in Passepartout's glass, and he fainted onto the floor. Mr. Fix left him there and walked out of the hotel. Good, he thought. Now Phileas Fogg will not find out that the Carnatic is leaving tonight, and he will have to wait for the next ship. That meant there would be 8 days for the warrant to arrive. Chapter 9. A Storm at Sea. While Mr. Fix and Passepartout were drinking in the hotel, Phileas Fogg and Mrs. Awuda were shopping. There were a lot of things that Mrs. Awuda needed for the journey to Europe. When they had bought everything they needed, they returned to the hotel and had a good meal. Mrs. Awuda went to bed, and Phileas read the newspapers. He was surprised when Passepartout did not return to the hotel that evening. Passepartout was not there in the morning either, so he ordered a carriage and took Mrs. Awuda to the harbor. He expected to find Passepartout waiting at the ship, but he was not there. Neither was the ship. Then he heard that the Carnatic had left the previous evening. "A small problem," he said to Mrs. Awuda. Then a man came up to him. It was Mr. Fix. "Excuse me, sir. I was expecting to find your servant here," he said. "So was I," said Phileas Fogg. "We were going to catch the Carnatic, but neither he nor the ship is here." "I was going to catch it too," said Mr. Fix. We'll have to wait a whole week to catch the next ship." He was careful not to let Phileas Fogg see how pleased he really was. "There are other ships and boats in Victoria Harbor," said Mr. Fogg. He walked away with Mrs. Awuda, already looking for another ship that might be ready to leave. Mr. Fix followed him. He searched for 3 hours before he could find a small boat. The captain did not think it was possible for his boat to go to Yokohama. It was too far for such a small boat. However, Phileas Fogg offered him a lot of money. In the end, he agreed to try. "We can go to Nagasaki or Shanghai instead of Yokohama," suggested the captain. "The ship that goes to America starts in Shanghai and then goes to Nagasaki and Yokohama. After that, it goes to San Francisco." Phileas agreed to go this way. It meant that they had 4 days to get to Shanghai. If the wind stays in the southwest, and we are lucky with the weather, and the sea stays calm, we can cover the 800 miles just in time. We can leave in an hour. "What about Passepartout?" asked Mrs. Awuda. "I'll do what I can," said Phileas. He left some money with the British consul, and some more money with the French consul to help Passepartout return to Europe if he was found. An hour later, they were on their way in the small boat called the Tankadere, captained by John Bunsby. There was a crew of 4 men. Mr. Fix accepted Phileas Fogg's invitation to come with them, so there were 3 passengers on the small ship. It weighed only 20 tons. As they left the harbor, they looked for Passepartout, but he was not there, and they were soon in the open sea. Traveling 800 miles on a small ship was a dangerous thing to do. It was even more dangerous at that time of the year because the China seas were rougher than usual. Phileas Fogg reminded John Bunsby that it was important to reach Shanghai as soon as possible. "We will do what we can," replied John Bunsby. Phileas stood on the deck, looking at the sea. Mrs. Awuda sat at the back of the ship. She was afraid of the dark ocean but trusted Phileas Fogg to keep her safe. Mr. Fix sat at the front of the ship. He did not speak to the others. He was not very happy because it seemed that Phileas Fogg would catch a ship to America and escape. He also felt guilty for accepting Phileas's help after treating his servant so badly. However, he believed it was his duty to stay with Mr. Fogg and arrest him if he could. The Tankadere sailed on through the night. The wind was very strong. By sunrise, they had traveled more than 100 miles. Phileas Fogg and Mrs. Awuda worried about Passepartout. They hoped that he had somehow got onto the Carnatic, and that they would meet him in Yokohama. Mrs. Awuda was especially sad because he had rescued her from the Sooty. She did not know if she would ever see him again. For the whole of that day, the Tankadere stayed close to the coast, where the sea was calmer and the winds were good. At midday, the wind changed direction, and the ship slowed down. 2 hours later, it changed again, and the ship went faster. While the 3 passengers were having their dinner, Mr. Fix told Phileas Fogg that he would pay his share of the cost of the journey. Phileas would not allow him to do so. The ship was making good progress, and John Bunsby told Phileas Fogg that they would probably arrive in time. The crew worked very hard and made sure that the ship was going as fast as it could. That evening, they had traveled 220 miles from Hong Kong. That night, the Tankadere was sailing through the Fokien Strait. The sea was very difficult because there were many different currents there. The ship slowed down. The rough sea made it almost impossible to stand on the deck. At dawn, the wind grew stronger. John Bunsby looked at the sky for a long time and then told Phileas Fogg that there would be a storm. "Will it come from the north or the south?" asked Phileas. "From the south," said John Bunsby. "Then it will blow us toward Shanghai," said Phileas. "That will help us if we can get there before the American steamship leaves for Nagasaki and Yokohama." John Bunsby prepared the ship to meet the storm. The crew took down most of the sails and closed every door and window to stop the water from getting into the ship. The captain wanted the passengers to go into the cabin, but they refused and stayed on deck. They waited for the storm, which soon came. It was a very violent storm. All that day, the ship sailed at a very fast speed, carried along by the huge waves and pushed by the strong wind. It often seemed to Mrs. Awuda that the large waves would sink the Tankadere, but the captain steered the ship well and kept it safe. Toward evening, the wind changed direction and blew across the ship. The waves now hit the ship from the side, and this was very dangerous. As night came, the storm grew stronger, and John Bunsby became quite worried. "I think we need to take shelter in a port," he told Phileas Fogg. "The storm is too strong." Phileas, however, did not agree. "We can take shelter in Shanghai," he said, and John Bunsby sailed on. It was a terrifying night. Sometimes the waves came right over the small ship. The crew and the passengers were all exhausted because they could not sleep. When daylight came, the wind returned to the south, and this helped the Tankadere to go in the right direction. It was still a difficult day, but by evening, the storm was almost over, and the night was quite calm. The following morning was the 11th of November, and they were about 100 miles from Shanghai. Phileas Fogg had to be in Shanghai that evening to catch the steamer for Yokohama. The crew worked as hard as they could, but the little ship could not make it in time. As they came into the harbor at Shanghai, they saw the American steamship leaving. Chapter 10. Passepartout Needs a Job. The Carnatic left Hong Kong on the 7th of November at 6:30 in the evening. It had a lot of passengers, but 2 cabins remained empty. These were the ones booked in the name of Mr. Phileas Fogg. The next morning, the crew saw a passenger who looked sick and had clearly slept in his clothes. He came onto the deck and sat on a box with his head in his hands. It was Passepartout. How did he get there? When Mr. Fix had left the hotel, 2 men had picked up Passepartout and put him onto a bed. A few hours later, however, he began to shout in his sleep, "The Carnatic! The Carnatic!" He got up and staggered out of the hotel. He saw the Carnatic and went toward it, still shouting. 2 sailors saw him. They picked him up and put him onto the ship. He fell asleep again as the ship left the harbor. When he woke up again, they were 150 miles off the coast. As he sat there with his head in his hands, he realized that he had drunk too much wine. "What will Mr. Fogg say about it?" he wondered. "At least I am on the ship, and that's the most important thing." He remembered the conversation with Mr. Fix. Should he tell his master that Fix was a police officer and wanted to arrest him for stealing £55,000 from the Bank of England? He wasn't sure. He got up and went to look for Phileas Fogg and Mrs. Awuda. He could not see them anywhere. Then he suddenly remembered. The ship had left early, and he had not told his master. Phileas Fogg would lose his bet because his servant drank too much wine. Passepartout was angry with himself and even angrier with Mr. Fix. What should he do? He was on his way to Yokohama, but he had no money. He would not be able to return. Luckily, his meals on the Carnatic were already paid for, so during the voyage, he ate and drank as much as he could. On the 13th of November, the Carnatic entered the harbor at Yokohama, near Tokyo. It was a large harbor, and ships from all over the world came to it. Passepartout, however, was not happy to arrive. He walked around the streets near the harbor. It was very busy there, and Passepartout saw many different kinds of people. There were soldiers and religious people. There were rich people in beautifully colored clothes, and women walking with small steps. The women blackened their teeth and wore kimonos with wide belts. Passepartout continued to walk and found himself in the countryside. He saw lots of rice growing in the fields and trees with beautiful large flowers. There were also cherry trees, plum trees, and apple trees with many different kinds of birds in them. He was beginning to grow hungry, but the trees had no fruit on them at this time of the year. He walked back into the town and saw a parade of acrobats with colored lights. At the harbor, he saw fishermen working on their boats. Finally, he found a place to rest and slept through the night. He was hungry when he woke up. He thought that he might earn some money by singing, but it was still too early. Then, he decided to sell his clothes and buy some cheap Japanese clothes to replace them. He did this and had enough money left over to buy some breakfast. He ate it wearing his strange costume. Then, he thought that he might be able to get a job as a cook or a servant on a ship, so he walked back to the harbor. On the way, he saw a poster advertising the last show of a circus that was leaving for America. "I wonder if I could get a job in that circus," he thought. "Perhaps they need a servant." He went to see the owner, who was an American, called Mr. Battlecar. "What do you want?" asked Mr. Battlecar. He thought Passepartout was Japanese because of the clothes he was wearing. "Do you need a servant?" "A servant? No, I have 2 servants already, and they do everything I ask. They are strong, and they work for nothing." He held out his 2 arms. So I can't be of any use to you at all? Passepartout asked. None at all. What a pity. It would have been very convenient for me to travel with you. Well, if you are Japanese, I'm a monkey, exclaimed Mr. Battle-Car. I'm French, explained Passepartout. Why are you wearing Japanese clothes? It's a long story. You wear what you can. That's true. Listen, I don't need a servant, but I may be able to use you as a clown. Can you sing? Yes, I can. Are you strong? Yes, especially after a good meal. Can you sing while you are upside down, spinning a top on one foot and balancing a sword on the other foot? Of course. Passepartout had a job. The show was to begin at 3 o'clock, and Passepartout did not have much time to prepare for it. His job was to be at the base of a human pyramid, the most important part of the show. By 3 o'clock, the audience had filled the large building. There were Europeans, Chinese, Japanese, and many other kinds of people. The men, women, and children all sat on benches and boxes facing the stage. The musicians came onto the stage and played while the circus performers prepared their acts. It was a very good show. One of the performers danced beautifully with a fan and small pieces of paper. He looked like a butterfly. Another performer made words in the air with the smoke of his pipe. A third performer juggled burning candles. There were acrobats, high-wire walkers, and clowns. The audience watched carefully and cheered the performers when they had finished their acts. The last act was the human pyramid. Passepartout put on his wonderful costume, including some wings and a very long nose, and went out to take his part in the act. The pyramid grew higher and higher until it almost touched the ceiling. The audience cheered loudly and clapped their hands. Suddenly, one of the performers at the base moved, and the whole pyramid came crashing down. The cause of the problem was, of course, Passepartout. He had left his position, climbed up into the audience, and hugged a man, shouting, "Oh, my master, my master!" The man and young lady next to him suddenly stood up, and the three of them began to rush out of the building. Mr. Battle-Car tried to stop them, but the man in the audience gave him some money. They quickly left the building. Soon, they were on the American steamship. Chapter 11. Crossing the Pacific Ocean. The man and young lady that Passepartout had seen in the audience at the circus were, of course, Phileas Fogg and Mrs. Aouda. How did they get there? Mrs. Aouda told Passepartout what had happened. As they sailed into the port of Shanghai on the Tankadere, they were just in time to see the American steamship leaving. Phileas Fogg told the captain to lower his flag and fire his small cannon. When John Bunsby did this, the American steamship came to see if there was a problem. Mr. Fogg offered its captain a lot of money to take him and his two friends on board, and the captain agreed. Phileas Fogg, Mrs. Aouda, and Mr. Fix all crossed safely on the steamship to Yokohama, where they arrived on the 14th of November. They were still on schedule. Phileas immediately went to look for his servant and was happy to discover that he had arrived in Yokohama on the Carnatic. He went to the British and French consulates, but they did not know anything about Passepartout. He walked around the streets for a while, and when he saw a poster advertising a circus, he remembered that Passepartout had worked in a circus before. Perhaps he was there. He went to the circus, and although he did not see Passepartout, Passepartout saw him. That led to the collapse of the human pyramid and the end of Passepartout's job in the circus. Passepartout told Mrs. Aouda and Phileas Fogg about his adventures, but decided not to tell them about Mr. Fix yet. The time did not seem right. The steamship weighed 2,500 tons and was called the General Grant. It had a powerful engine and a lot of sails. It usually crossed the Pacific Ocean in less than 21 days. Phileas Fogg could predict that he would arrive in San Francisco by the 2nd of December, New York by the 11th, and London by the 20th. To win his bet, he had to be back in London on the 21st. There were a large number of passengers on the General Grant. Some of them were English, and a lot of them were American. Most of them, however, were Chinese. They were immigrating to America. Phileas Fogg remained as silent and calm as ever during this part of the journey. Mrs. Aouda watched him and began to like him more and more. He made her feel very calm and safe. She became very interested in his bet and was happy when Passepartout told her that they would almost certainly get to London on time. On the 23rd of November, 9 days after leaving Yokohama, Passepartout had gone exactly halfway around the world. He had used 52 days and only had 28 days left. The last half of the journey would be a lot easier and faster than the first half. Something happened on that day which made Passepartout a very happy man. He looked at his watch, and it was the same as the time on the ship's clock, although he had never changed the time on it. "What a fool that man was," he said. "He told me to change the time on my watch in every country, but I always knew that I was right and the other clocks were wrong." Passepartout did not realize that his watch showed 9 o'clock in the evening, while the time on the ship was in the morning. They were now exactly 12 hours ahead of London time. Mr. Fix was also on the General Grant. In Yokohama, he had gone to the English consul's office and had, at last, received his warrant to arrest Fogg. However, it was too late now. Mr. Fogg was no longer in British territory, and Mr. Fix needed a different warrant. He decided to follow Mr. Fogg back to England and arrest him there. That's why he was on the General Grant, although he tried to stay away from Passepartout. He didn't want to be recognized. The next day, however, he was on the deck when Passepartout saw him and attacked him. He hit him several times and knocked him down. Mr. Fix stood up and looked at Passepartout. "Have you finished?" "Yes, for the moment." "Then let me tell you something." Mr. Fix explained to Passepartout that he had tried to slow Phileas Fogg down because he was waiting for the warrant to arrest him. Now, however, he could not arrest him because he was not in British territory. "I want him to get back into British territory as soon as possible, so I will do everything I can to help him. I will not try to slow him down. I will try to help him go faster." Passepartout listened carefully. It seemed to make sense. "Are we friends?" asked Mr. Fix, holding out his hand. "No," replied Passepartout. "We are not friends, but we can work together. However, if you do anything to slow him down, I will break your head." "Agreed," said the police officer. On the 3rd of December, the General Grant arrived in San Francisco. Phileas Fogg was exactly on schedule. It was 6 o'clock in the morning when Phileas Fogg disembarked from the General Grant. He went straight to the railway station. The next train to New York was due to leave at 6 o'clock that evening. They would have to wait the whole day. They took a carriage to a good hotel, admiring the wide streets and neat houses as they went along. Passepartout was surprised. He had expected a small town, but this was a large and very modern city. The International Hotel was just like an English hotel, and Passepartout felt at home. Somebody told Passepartout about the Sioux and the Pawnees. They were people who stopped trains and robbed the passengers. He asked his master if he should buy some guns. "I don't think we will need guns," he replied, "but you can do as you like." He left Passepartout and went to the office of the consul with Mrs. Aouda to have his passport stamped. On the way, he met Mr. Fix. The police officer seemed very surprised to see him. "I must go back to England," he told Phileas. "Then you must come with us," replied the traveler. Mr. Fix agreed, and they walked around San Francisco together with Mrs. Aouda. On Montgomery Street, they saw a huge number of people on the road. People were looking out of every window. There were even people on the roofs of the houses. There were flags, streamers, and a lot of shouting. "Hooray for Cammerfield! Hooray for Mandy Boy!" It was an election rally, and Mr. Fix thought that they should stay away from it. "I am sure they will fight at the end of it," he said. Phileas Fogg agreed, and they climbed some steps leading up to another street. They stayed there to see what would happen. The people were very noisy and moved about, waving their flags and banners. The people began to get angry. Soon they were hitting each other with their fists as well as their flags. Boots and shoes flew through the air, and guns were waved. Suddenly, a large group of people shouting, "Hooray, Mandy Boy!" came from the street behind them. Some of them had sticks, and others threw stones. A man with a red beard tried to hit Phileas, but hit Mr. Fix instead. Phileas was angry and demanded that the man tell them his name. "Colonel Stamp Proctor," shouted the man, "and stay out of my way next time." When the crowd had gone past them, their clothes were torn, and Mr. Fix was lying on the ground. They helped him up and immediately went to buy some new clothes before returning to the hotel. Passepartout was there. He had bought a large number of guns, ready to fight the Sioux if they attacked the train. Phileas promised that he would return to America and find Colonel Stamp Proctor one day. "No English gentleman should be insulted like that," he said. They went to the station and arrived just in time to catch the train to New York. Chapter 12. Across America by Train. The railway line across America had two sections. The first was the Central Pacific and ran from San Francisco to Ogden. The second was the Union Pacific, which ran from Ogden to Omaha. 5 different lines met at Omaha, and it was easy to catch a train to New York from there. The whole distance was 3,786 miles and could be traveled in 7 days. Before the railway was built, it could take 6 months to travel across America. Phileas Fogg hoped to be in New York by the 11th of December, when he could catch a steamship across the Atlantic to Liverpool. The cars on this train were long and did not have separate sections in them. The seats faced each other along the sides of the passenger car with a corridor between them. The passengers were able to go from one end of the train to the other by using the little platforms between the passenger cars. There were special cars for dining and drinking, and each car had its own toilet and bathroom. The train left San Francisco at 6 o'clock in the evening. It was already dark, and Passepartout thought that it might snow. It was very cold. Passepartout was sitting next to Mr. Fix, but would not speak to him. An hour later it began to snow, but it was not heavy enough to slow down the train. At 8 o'clock, the passengers made their seats into beds by folding down the backs of their seats. Thick curtains gave every passenger a private sleeping area. The train sped across California as they slept. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the seats in the passenger cars were back in their normal position. The passengers could see the Nevada mountains through the windows. The railway line followed the Sierra River. It did not travel very fast here because there were a lot of bends. There were not many tunnels or bridges. It had been faster to make the line go around the mountains than to go through them. The passengers had 20 minutes to eat lunch in Reno. Then the railway line followed the Humboldt River. During the afternoon, the train had to stop for a few hours while 10 or 12,000 buffalo crossed the railway line. Phileas Fogg sat calmly in his seat while the other passengers walked up and down impatiently, waiting for the buffalo to pass. Passepartout was especially impatient. He would have liked to shoot the buffalo with his guns. He could hardly believe that the train had to wait for 3 whole hours. At last it moved on, and that evening the travelers entered Utah. Passepartout, with about 30 other passengers, spent a few hours the next day listening to a religious lecture. As the lecture went on, people began to leave. Soon there were only 20 people listening, then 10. At the end, only Passepartout was still there. When the preacher asked him to join his church, Passepartout refused and left. The preacher had no audience at all. The train was now on the edge of the Great Salt Lake. The passengers had a good view of this lake. It was about 70 miles long and 35 miles wide. There was so much salt in this lake that fish could not live in it. There were many good farms around the lake, but these were all covered in snow. The train stopped at Ogden for a few hours, and Phileas Fogg and his companions had time to visit a nearby city, where men often had more than one wife. Passepartout thought that this was very strange and felt sorry for the husbands who had to care for so many wives. A few minutes before 4 o'clock, the passengers were all on the train again, and it began to move away from the station. Passepartout saw a man running after the train and calling for it to stop. The train did not stop, but the man ran quickly and jumped onto one of the little platforms. He lay on one of the seats, almost out of breath. He complained that his wives were fighting. Passepartout was not surprised that he wanted to escape. The train left the Great Salt Lake and went north to the River Weber. Then it went east into the Wasatch Range. This was very mountainous land, and the train traveled slowly. Everybody except Phileas Fogg was becoming impatient and worried. It traveled on through the night. It snowed again that night, but luckily the train could travel through it. The train stopped at Green River for a short time, and here Mrs. Aouda saw a man who made her afraid. It was Colonel Stamp Proctor, the American who had tried to hit Phileas Fogg in San Francisco. She hoped that he had not seen her and that Phileas Fogg would not see him. She did not want them to fight. She told Mr. Fix and Passepartout what she had seen. "Don't worry," said Mr. Fix. "If he wants to fight Mr. Fogg, he will have to fight me first." "And me," added Passepartout, "even if he is a colonel." "Mr. Fogg will not let anybody fight for him," said Mrs. Aouda. "We have to make sure that they do not see each other. If they fight, it could take a lot of time, and then Mr. Fogg will lose his bet." The others agreed. They bought some cards, and soon they were playing whist with Phileas Fogg. They thought that this would prevent him from getting up and perhaps seeing Colonel Stamp Proctor. The train continued eastwards as they played and had their lunch. Early in the afternoon it stopped. Passepartout looked out the window, but there was no station. Why had the train stopped? He went out, together with about 40 other passengers, to find the answer to this question. He found the driver arguing with a railway man, who said that they could not go further because the bridge at Medicine Bow was not very strong, and the train was too heavy. Colonel Proctor was there. He asked what would happen. The railway man told them that another train was coming from the other direction to pick them up. First, they would have to walk to the next station, which was 12 miles away. Colonel Proctor was very angry and shouted at the railway man. Passepartout was angry too, but he kept quiet. He decided that he would have to tell his master. Just then, the driver shouted, "We can do it." "How?" Passepartout stayed to listen. "If the train goes fast enough, we'll get across, even if the bridge falls down." A lot of passengers agreed with him, although Passepartout thought he was mad. "I think I know an easier way," he began to say to another passenger. The passenger would not listen. "This is not a time for thinking. This is a time for action." Passepartout tried to talk to other passengers, including Colonel Proctor, but none of them would listen. They all got back onto the train. "We should walk across the bridge first and let the train come afterwards," Passepartout told himself. The card players were still busy with their game of whist. The train began to move. It went faster and faster. It was going so fast that the passengers did not even see the bridge coming up. However, they got across. They were going so fast that it took 5 miles for the train to stop. A few minutes later, the bridge collapsed into the river. Chapter 13. Attacked by Sioux. The train went past Fort Saunders and went on to Evans Pass. This was its highest point, at 8,091 feet above sea level. They had traveled 1,382 miles from San Francisco, and this had taken 3 days and 3 nights. Phileas Fogg was still on schedule. The next day, he and his 2 companions were playing whist again, when a man came into their passenger car. It was Colonel Proctor. He and Phileas Fogg recognized each other immediately. Both Mr. Fix and Passepartout tried to fight Colonel Proctor, but Phileas Fogg would not allow it. "I promised that I would fight you," he said to Colonel Proctor. "However, I am in a hurry to return to England. Will you agree to meet me in 6 months' time?" Colonel Proctor laughed. 6 months? Why not make it 6 years?" "I said 6 months, and I will be there on time," said Phileas. "I don't think you want to fight. You are afraid. It's now or never." "Are you going to New York?" asked Phileas Fogg. "No." "Chicago?" "No." "Omaha?" "Do you know Plum Creek? It's the next station, and the train will arrive there in an hour. It will stop for 10 minutes, and that is long enough for a duel." "Good," said Phileas. "I'll get off at Plum Creek, and you won't be getting on again." Phileas Fogg sat down and continued his game of whist. When the train stopped at Plum Creek, Phileas Fogg got off the train with Mr. Fix and Passepartout, who was carrying 2 guns. Mrs. Aouda stayed in the passenger car. She was pale and felt sick. Colonel Proctor and a friend also got off the train. Suddenly the conductor rushed up to them. "Get back on," he shouted. "The train is late, and we must leave immediately." "But I have to fight a duel with this Englishman," said the colonel. "If you don't get on now, we will leave you here." They got back onto the train just as it began to move. "I'm sorry," said the conductor. "Why don't you have your duel in one of the cars?" They all thought this was a good idea. The conductor asked all of the people in one car to leave for a few minutes, and the 2 men got their guns ready for a duel. Just as they were about to begin, they heard shouting from outside the train. Then they heard guns. The train was being attacked by a band of Sioux. Some of the Sioux rode up to the speeding train on their horses and jumped onto it, waving their guns. Most of the passengers had guns too, and soon there was a lot of firing. Even Mrs. Aouda took a gun and shot at the Sioux. A few Sioux broke into the baggage car and threw the baggage out. The fighting went on for 10 minutes. They were getting closer to a station. The driver knew that there were some soldiers at the station. He tried to stop the train so that the soldiers could come to help them. However, he was hit by a bullet. Passepartout was very brave. He got to the front of the cars and unhooked the engine from the cars. The engine kept going, but the cars stopped. They were close to the station now, and the soldiers came and chased the Sioux away. The conductor checked to see if all the passengers were safe. 3 of them were missing. One of them was Passepartout. Colonel Proctor was injured and was taken to the station. Mr. Fix was also injured, but it was not serious. Mr. Fogg was not hurt. Mrs. Aouda was safe. They looked everywhere for Passepartout but could not find him. What should they do? Phileas Fogg stood and thought about it. "I will find him dead or alive," he said to Mrs. Aouda. The Sioux must have taken him and the other passengers as hostages. She realized what this meant. He would miss the steamship from New York. He would lose the bet. She thought it was wonderful that he would do this for his servant. Mr. Fogg spoke to the captain of the soldiers, and 30 men agreed to help Phileas Fogg find the missing passengers. Phileas Fogg asked Mr. Fix to stay and look after Mrs. Aouda. Mr. Fix did not want to let Phileas Fogg out of his sight, but he had to agree. "I'll stay here," he promised. Phileas Fogg and the 30 soldiers left, and Mr. Fix stayed with Mrs. Aouda. He began to believe that Phileas would not return. "How will I catch him now? And I have the arrest warrant in my pocket. I must be stupid." That's what the police officer was thinking as the hours went by. It began to snow again, and he began to wonder if he should leave Fogg and return to England by himself. At 2 o'clock, everybody was surprised to hear a train coming from the east. No train was due until the next day. Then they realized that it was the engine that Passepartout had unhooked from the cars. It had stopped when it ran out of steam. Soon afterwards, the driver recovered, started the engine, and drove it back. Everybody was very pleased, and the driver said that he would continue the journey immediately. "You must wait for the other passengers," said Mrs. Aouda. "I cannot wait. We are already 3 hours late." Mrs. Aouda refused to get on the train. Mr. Fix stayed with her. All the other passengers, including Colonel Proctor, got on the train, and it left. Mrs. Aouda and Mr. Fix waited at the station in the snow. Night fell. A man came up to Mr. Fix and spoke to him. Mr. Fix shook his head and sent him away. By morning, the captain of the soldiers was very worried. He decided to send out some more soldiers to find the 30 that were now missing. He told them to get ready. Then they heard a gunshot. They all rushed out to see that Phileas Fogg was returning with the missing passengers, including Passepartout. They had found them near Fort Kearny and fought the Sioux. In the end, they were able to rescue all of the passengers. Mr. Fix was especially surprised to see them. He had not expected them to return. "The train! The train! Where is the train?" This was Passepartout, who had suddenly realized that the train was not there. "It has gone," said Mr. Fix. "When is the next train due?" asked Phileas Fogg. "Not until this evening." Chapter 14. A Strange Way to Travel. Phileas Fogg was 20 hours behind schedule. Passepartout felt very bad. If his master had not come to rescue him, he would still be on schedule. "Are you really in a hurry?" asked Mr. Fix. "I am," replied Phileas Fogg. "Do you really want to catch the steamship to Liverpool?" "I do." "Do you want to try?" "How? On foot?" "No, by sledge. A man offered me this way of traveling. It is a sledge with sails." This was the man who had spoken to Mr. Fix during the night. Mr. Fix had sent him away, but he was still walking around near the station. Phileas Fogg went to speak to him. His name was Mr. Mudge, and he showed Phileas his strange sledge. There was room for 5 or 6 people on the sledge. It had a tall mast and a huge sail. It was a sledge, but it looked like a sailing ship. Sledges like this were used when the trains could not cross the plains in winter. If the wind blew from the right direction, the sledge could be as fast as the train, and sometimes even faster. The wind was strong and the snow was hard. Mr. Mudge said that he could get to Omaha in a few hours. Then it would be easy to get a train to New York in time to catch the steamship, because there were so many trains running from Omaha to New York. Phileas Fogg agreed. He suggested that Mrs. Aouda stay at the station because it would be too cold on the sledge. Passepartout would stay with her. However, she would not agree. "I do not want to stay here. I will come with you. I am not afraid of the cold," she said. Passepartout was very pleased to hear this because he did not want to leave his master either. He could not let Mr. Fix and his master leave without him. Mr. Fix, meanwhile, did not know what to think about Phileas Fogg. Was he a thief? Was he just a strange gentleman? Why did he risk his life to rescue Passepartout? Was he really going back to England? He could not answer these questions, but he had the arrest warrant in his pocket, and he was determined to do his duty. He would arrest him as soon as he arrived in England. By 8 o'clock, the sledge was ready to leave. The travelers sat on it and covered themselves with blankets and rugs. The sails went up, and the sledge began to slide across the hard snow. Mr. Mudge hoped to reach Omaha by 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The sledge moved very quickly across the flat land. The travelers were very cold and could not speak to each other because of the wind. Mr. Mudge sat at the rudder and steered the sledge in a straight line. Sometimes the sledge went so fast that the passengers thought it would be lifted into the air by the wind. Mr. Mudge went as fast as he could. Phileas Fogg had offered him extra money if he got there quickly. The land was as flat as the sea. The railway followed the river, but the sledge took a shorter way. The mast was held up by metal wires, and they sang in the wind as the sledge sped across the plain. They would not reach New York until the evening of the 11th, though they had planned to arrive in the morning. However, they might still be in time for the steamship to Liverpool. Passepartout certainly hoped that they would be. He even felt friendlier toward Mr. Fix, who had got the sledge for them. The strange ship sailed all the way to Omaha and arrived there before 1 o'clock, just as Mr. Mudge had predicted. Passepartout and Mr. Fix jumped out and moved around to try and make themselves warm. They helped Phileas Fogg and Mrs. Awuda get off the sledge. Then, Phileas paid Mr. Mudge a large sum of money before they all rushed into the station. A train to New York was just about to leave, and they got onto it quickly. Soon they were speeding on their way again. The train crossed into Iowa, and later that night it crossed the Mississippi at Davenport. At 4 o'clock the following afternoon, it reached Chicago on Lake Michigan. It was 900 miles from Chicago to New York, but the train was fast. It raced through Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. At last, New York came into view. On the 11th of December, at 11:15 in the evening, it stopped at the station. It was on the right bank of the river, just where the steamships left for England. There was a problem. The China, going to Liverpool, had left 45 minutes earlier. There would not be another steamship going to Europe for 2 days. The first would be a French ship, but it was not even going to England, and Phileas would never be in time to win his bet. Was it all over? Had he lost? Passepartout was very angry with himself when he thought of the things he had done on the journey. He realized that he had slowed his master down instead of helping him. He had also cost him a lot of money. "We'll decide what to do tomorrow," said Phileas Fogg. "Come along." He called a carriage, and they went to a hotel. That night, only Phileas Fogg slept well. The others all had reasons to worry. The next day was the 12th of December. At 7 o'clock that morning, there were just 9 days, 13 hours, and 45 minutes left. That's when Phileas Fogg had to be in the drawing room of the Reform Club if he was to win his bet. If he had caught the China, he would have arrived in Liverpool and then London before the deadline. Mr. Fogg left the hotel alone. He told Passepartout that he and Mrs. Awuda should be ready to leave immediately. Then he walked to the banks of the river and looked for ships that were about to leave. Every day, hundreds of ships left this port for various parts of the world. Most of them, however, were sailing ships, and these were not fast enough for Phileas Fogg. He needed a steamship. He searched all over the port and was just about to return to the hotel when he saw a steamship tied up at the dock. It had smoke coming from its funnel. It was about to leave. He called out to the captain, "Are you about to leave?" "In an hour." "Where are you going?" "Bordeaux." "What are you carrying?" "Nothing." "Do you have passengers?" "No, I never take passengers. They are too much trouble." "Is your ship fast?" "Yes, it is." "Will you take me and 3 other people to Liverpool?" The captain would not agree. Finally, Phileas Fogg offered him 10 times the normal price, and even then he would agree only to take them to Bordeaux. "I'm leaving at 9 o'clock," he said. It was already 8:30. Phileas Fogg calmly went back to the hotel where Mrs. Awuda, Passepartout, and Mr. Fix were waiting, ready to leave. By 9 o'clock, when the Henrietta sailed, they were all on board. Chapter 15. Mr. Fix Wins at Last. Phileas Fogg had paid a lot of money to Captain Speedy of the Henrietta to take him and his traveling companions to Bordeaux. An hour after they got on the steamship, it was already out at sea. It followed the coastline that day and through the night. Then it headed east. At midday, a man climbed onto the ship's bridge and took the bearings. This was not Captain Speedy, but Phileas Fogg. What was he doing, and why was Captain Speedy shouting loudly from his cabin? The answer to that question is very simple. Phileas Fogg wanted to go to Liverpool. Captain Speedy would not take him there. Phileas Fogg paid the crew to obey him, locked up the captain, and took over the ship. The Henrietta was now sailing to Liverpool. It was also very clear that Phileas Fogg had once been a sailor. For the first few days, the weather was wonderful, and the steamship went very fast. Passepartout was very happy, although Mrs. Awuda was very worried. Poor Mr. Fix did not know what to think. He wondered where the ship was going. With Phileas Fogg acting as captain, it might be going to some other part of the world, and he would never be able to arrest the thief. Perhaps Phileas Fogg had decided to become a pirate. Captain Speedy continued to shout from his cabin, but Phileas Fogg took no notice of him at all. On the 13th, they reached Newfoundland, and the weather changed. It became very cold, and the wind blew from the wrong direction. Mr. Fogg used the steam engine, but the ship could not go very fast in the high waves. Passepartout was afraid, but Phileas was a good sailor, and he continued to fight the sea and go forward. Sometimes the ship went through the waves instead of going over them. On the 16th of December, they were halfway across the ocean, and the most difficult part of the journey had been done. However, there was a new problem. The engineer told Phileas Fogg that the ship was running out of coal. Without coal to burn, they would have no steam. They would have to depend on sails. This would make them very slow. They would never get there in time. When Passepartout heard this, he told Mr. Fix, "So you really think we are going to Liverpool?" said the police officer. "Of course." "Idiot." Mr. Fix walked away. What would Mr. Fogg do? That evening he called the engineer and told him to keep burning coal until there was none left. 2 days later, the engineer told Phileas that they would run out of coal that day. "Passepartout, let Captain Speedy out of his cabin and ask him to come up here," said Phileas Fogg. Passepartout was frightened. What would Captain Speedy do? However, he led him out of the cabin and followed him up the deck. "Where are we?" shouted the captain. 770 miles from Liverpool," answered Phileas Fogg. "You are a pirate," shouted the captain. "I want you to sell me your ship," said Phileas Fogg. The answer was very short and loud. "No, I am afraid I have to burn it. We are running out of coal." "Burn my ship? A ship worth $50,000? "Here is $60,000, said Phileas Fogg, giving him the money. Captain Speedy was suddenly a lot quieter, and then he suddenly agreed. He put the money in his pocket. Mr. Fogg was now the captain. He ordered the crew to take everything that was made of wood and burn it when there was no more coal. That day, they burned the cabins, the deck houses, and the crew's rooms. The next day, the 19th of December, they burned all of the masts. On the 20th, they burned the rails and most of the deck. There was not much left to burn, but they could see the coast of Ireland. However, it was 10 o'clock in the evening, and Phileas Fogg had less than 24 hours to get to London. It would take that long to get to Liverpool, even if the Henrietta could steam at top speed all the way. They could see Queenstown, an Irish port, and Phileas decided to go there. He knew that there was a fast train that went from there to Dublin, and then they could go via fast steamship to Liverpool. This was 12 hours faster than going by ship to Liverpool, and he would still get to London in time. They had to wait a few hours before they could get into Queenstown because of the tide. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Henrietta entered Queenstown Harbor, and Phileas Fogg said goodbye to Captain Speedy. Then he went ashore with Passepartout, Mrs. Awuda, and Mr. Fix. Mr. Fix wanted to arrest him immediately. However, he did not do it. Why not? Perhaps he had changed his mind. Perhaps he realized that he was wrong. He was not sure. He stayed with Mr. Fogg, however, and they all got on the train to Dublin. It was 1:30 in the morning. The train arrived in Dublin as morning broke, and Phileas Fogg got onto one of the fast steamships that went to Liverpool. He arrived there at midday on the 21st of December. He was only 6 hours from London. At that moment, Mr. Fix went up to him and put his hand on his shoulder. "Phileas Fogg?" "Yes. In the name of the Queen, I arrest you." Passepartout tried to attack Mr. Fix, but some police officers held on to him and stopped him. Mrs. Awuda could not understand what was happening and was soon in tears. Phileas Fogg was taken away and put in prison. He would have to stay there overnight and go to court the next day. To win his bet and avoid financial ruin, he needed to be at the Reform Club in London at 8:45 that evening. He sat in prison, looking at his watch. 1 o'clock passed. 2 o'clock passed. Phileas looked at his watch again. At 2:33, there was a noise outside his door. Then Passepartout and Mr. Fix came rushing in. "I'm sorry, sir. I was wrong. The thief was arrested 3 days ago. You are free to go." Phileas Fogg went up to the police officer. He looked him in the eye. Suddenly, he hit Mr. Fix with his fists. The police officer fell to the floor, but he did not say a word. Phileas Fogg, Passepartout, and Mr. Awuda raced to Liverpool station. It was 2:40. The next train to London did not leave until 3 o'clock. When they arrived in London, all the clocks showed that it was 10 minutes to 9. Phileas Fogg had gone all around the world, but he had arrived 5 minutes late. He walked home with Passepartout and Mrs. Awuda. He had lost. Chapter 16. Phileas Fogg returns home. Phileas Fogg had to be at the Reform Club at 8:45. He arrived in London at 8:50. He told Passepartout to buy some food, and then he went home. He was ruined. He had traveled around the world. There had been many problems, but he had solved them all. He had spent almost all his money. The only money he still had was the £20,000 he had to give to his friends at the Reform Club. Mrs. Awuda stayed in a room in his house in Savile Row. She was very frightened because she thought that Phileas was going to kill himself. Passepartout was also watching him carefully. The night went by, but none of them slept. In the morning, Phileas Fogg told Passepartout to prepare breakfast for Mrs. Awuda. "I will be very busy today," he said. "I would like to speak to Mrs. Awuda for a few moments this evening, if she will see me." Passepartout felt terrible. If only he had warned his master about Mr. Fix. "It's all my fault," he exclaimed to Phileas Fogg. "I don't blame anybody," said Phileas Fogg calmly. Passepartout spoke to Mrs. Awuda. "I'm afraid that he will do something terrible," he said. "I can't stop him. Can you?" "I don't know what I can do," she replied. "He wants to speak to me this evening, doesn't he? Let's wait until then." At 11:30, Phileas Fogg did not go to the Reform Club as he used to do at that time. He stayed in his room. Time passed very slowly for Passepartout and Mrs. Awuda that day. Passepartout listened at the door of Phileas's room, and even looked through the keyhole to make sure that he was still alive. At 7:30, Phileas came out of his room and went to see Mrs. Awuda. He was still very calm. "I am sorry that I brought you to England," he said. "I was a rich man when I decided to do that. I intended to give you some of my wealth, and you would have been happy and free. But now I have nothing to give you. I am poor." "I know, Mr. Fogg," she replied. "I am sorry if I caused you any delay in your travel. You could not stay in India. However, I would like to give you everything that I still have. It is not much." "What will happen to you?" asked the young lady. "I will need nothing," he answered. "But your relatives and friends will look after you. I have no friends or relatives." Mrs. Awuda stood up. "Mr. Fogg, I would like to be your friend and your relative. I would like to be your wife." Mr. Fogg also stood up. There was a strange expression on his face. He closed his eyes. Then he opened them again and looked at the young lady. "I love you," he said. "Yes, I will be your husband. We will be poor, but we will be happy." They called for Passepartout and told him the happy news. Passepartout was delighted. "Is it too late to tell the minister that we want to be married?" asked Phileas Fogg. "It is never too late." "It is just 8:05. I will go there now," replied Passepartout. "Tomorrow it will be Monday, and it will be our wedding day," said Phileas Fogg. When the newspapers reported that the real bank robber had been arrested, everybody suddenly remembered Phileas Fogg. He was not the robber after all. Would he then return to London in time to win his bet? At the time of the arrest, nobody had heard from Phileas Fogg since he had left. Nobody knew where he was. Was he still alive? Would he suddenly appear in the drawing room of the Reform Club and claim his money? On Saturday evening, there was a large crowd outside the Reform Club. They all wanted to see if Phileas Fogg would arrive before 8:45. The 5 members of the Reform Club, who had made the bet with Phileas Fogg, were waiting in the drawing room. At 8:25, one of them stood up and said, "Gentlemen, the last train from Liverpool arrived in London at 7:23. The next train doesn't arrive until 10 past midnight. If Phileas Fogg had arrived on the train at 7:23, he would have been here by now. He is not here. I think we have won our bet." "I think it is too early," said another member. "You know that Phileas Fogg likes to be exact. He may decide to arrive here at exactly 8:45. If he walked in through the door now, I wouldn't believe my eyes," said another. "I agree," said one of them. "His plan was mad from the very beginning." It was 8:40. We have not heard from him at all. He is probably about 20 days behind schedule. He has lost. I am certain of it. It was 8:42. At 8:44 and 50 seconds, the door opened. Phileas Fogg walked in. "Here I am, gentlemen," he said calmly. How could Phileas Fogg be there on time? Passepartout had gone to the minister's house and spoken to him about the wedding. Suddenly, he rushed out and ran as fast as he could to his master's house in Savile Row. He could hardly speak. "Cannot marry tomorrow," he managed to say to his master. "Tomorrow is Sunday. Today is Saturday. It is Sunday today," said Phileas Fogg. "No, it is Saturday," said Passepartout. He began to pull his master to the door and out of the house. "Quickly, you must go to the Reform Club. You have 10 minutes left." Phileas got into a carriage and raced to the club. He arrived at 8:45, as we have seen. He won his bet. Why did Phileas Fogg think it was Sunday when it was only Saturday? The answer is simple. He traveled around the world from east to west, so he gained a day. The days were 4 minutes shorter for every meridian that he passed. Mr. Fix and Sir Francis Cromarty had tried to explain this to Passepartout. He crossed 360 meridians when he went around the world, and 360 multiplied by 4 minutes makes 24 hours. That is why he was a day earlier than he had thought. Phileas Fogg won his £20,000. He had spent almost that much on the journey, so he was no richer than when he started. But he was not poorer either. However, he was a lot happier because he married Mrs. Awuda 2 days later, on the following Monday.
Playlet, Around the World in 80 Days. Scene 1. The scene is the railway station at Calcutta. Mr. Fix is standing on the platform with an Indian police officer.
"Hello, everybody. My name is Mr. Fix. I'm a police officer. I'm at this railway station in Calcutta waiting for a train. I don't want to catch the train. I want to catch a criminal who is on the train. He should be here soon. He's a very, very clever criminal. He stole £55,000 from the Bank of England. He thinks that he has escaped, but I, Mr. Fix, will catch him and get the reward. We are going to arrest him and his servant. Are you ready, officer?"
Yes, sir.
"Good. Don't forget, you must arrest both of them."
Yes, sir.
You see, everybody, there are 2 of them. The criminal, whose name is Mr. Phileas Fogg, has a helper. His name is Passepartout. Don't tell anybody. They might escape. You see, I can't arrest Mr. Fogg because we are in India and I don't have a warrant. The police in London have not sent it yet, but I will get him. Ha ha! I will get him.
Sir, if you don't have a warrant, why must I arrest Mr. Fogg as well as Passepartout?
Because Passepartout is his servant, you fool. Fogg is guilty too. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
You see, I couldn't get a warrant here because he committed his crime in England. But now his servant has committed a crime in India. I have a warrant for Passepartout. By the time he sorts out his problems, the warrant from London will arrive, and I will arrest Fogg. Ah, the train has arrived. Soon I will have him. Are you ready, officer?
Yes, sir.
Phileas Fogg, Mrs. Aouda, and Passepartout enter.
There they are, officer. Oh, I wonder who that pretty girl is. She is beautiful, but I will arrest her too if she is helping them.
Excuse me, sir. Are you Mr. Phileas Fogg?
Yes, I am.
And is this man your servant?
Yes, he is.
Please come with me. You will appear before Judge Obadiah at 8:30.
Ha ha! He will not escape this time. But I will follow them just to make sure.
Scene 2. The scene is a courtroom. A judge sits behind a table. A clerk sits at another table. The officer enters, followed by the 3 travelers. Passepartout and Mrs. Aouda look worried, but Phileas Fogg does not. Mr. Fix comes in after them and goes to sit with the audience.
Your Honor, here are Mr. Phileas Fogg and his servant Passepartout. Good. Who is this pretty young lady?
Your Honor, I am Mrs. Aouda. I would like to say that these 2 men are the bravest and kindest men that I have ever met. I am sure that they are innocent of any crime.
Thank you, Mrs. Aouda. The court will decide if they are innocent or guilty. What is their crime, clerk?
They have acted against Indian religion, Your Honor.
Ah, yes. How do you plead, Phileas Fogg?
I suppose we are guilty, but we could not let this poor young lady die.
I would do it all again.
What are you talking about? You have admitted that you are guilty, but the crime has nothing to do with this young lady. She may sit down. Call the witnesses.
Witnesses in the case against Phileas Fogg and Passepartout.
2 priests enter. One of them is carrying a pair of shoes.
My shoes, my shoes.
Yes, they are his shoes, Your Honor. This proves that he is guilty. He is guilty. He knocked me down in the temple. He is a bad man.
Are these your shoes, Passepartout?
Yes, they are, sir. They are the shoes the priests took from me when I wore them in the temple in Bombay. He wore them in the temple. Then he knocked down 2 priests and ran away. This is a terrible crime.
There is no need to make this a long trial. Passepartout is guilty. I will sentence him to jail.
Your Honor, it is important that we catch a steamship this afternoon. I will pay whatever fine you set. Passepartout is guilty, but he did not know that you should take off your shoes in the temple.
That may be true, but he should have known. And because he is your servant, you should have told him. That is why you are guilty too. I sentence Passepartout to 15 days in jail, and I also fine him £300. I sentence Phileas Fogg to 8 days in jail, and I fine him £150. Officer?
Yes, sir.
Take these 2 men to jail.
Yes, sir.
Wait, I will pay a much bigger fine if you cancel the jail sentences.
How much will you pay?
I will pay £500 each.
If you pay £1,000 each, I will let you go. I am sure the priests would be happy with this donation to their temple.
Yes, sir.
Clerk, write down that the prisoners have paid £1,000 each.
Yes, sir.
Phileas Fogg and Passepartout, you are guilty, and you will pay the fine. Be careful to keep the law and respect Indian religion in the future.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I have my shoes, please?
Thank you, Your Honor. The priest gives Passepartout his shoes. They all leave the court. Mr. Fix stands and turns to face the audience.
I always have bad luck. Now he will escape again. I will have to go with him to Hong Kong.